I never believed in the old legends that haunted our small town. They were just stories parents told their kids to keep them from wandering too far into the woods. But everything changed the night we decided to camp by Blackwood Forest, under the eerie light of a full moon. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway with friends. We arrived at the campsite just before dusk, laughter echoing through the trees as we set up our tents. The air was cool, the sky clear, and the forest seemed to hum with life. But as darkness fell, an unsettling silence took over, the kind that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. We gathered around the campfire, swapping ghost stories and roasting marshmallows. Kevin, always the skeptic, laughed off the warnings of the locals. "There's no such thing as monsters," he declared, his voice breaking the tension. But then, we heard it, a low, guttural growl, like nothing we'd ever heard before. It came from deep within the forest, sending a shiver down my spine. We fell silent, straining our ears to catch any other sound. The night was still, too still, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. "Probably just a coyote," Lisa said, her voice trembling. But we all knew it was more than that. As the hours dragged on, the sounds grew louder and closer. The growls turned into snarls, interspersed with eerie howls that made our blood run cold. We huddled closer to the fire, our nerves frayed, eyes darting to the shadows that danced around us. Suddenly, a branch snapped behind us, and we whipped around, hearts pounding. Nothing. Just the darkness and the oppressive silence. But then, in the flickering firelight, I saw it, a pair of glowing eyes, reflecting the flames. They were watching us, unblinking and filled with a malevolent hunger. "It's just an animal," Kevin whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. We knew we had to do something, but fear paralyzed us, rooting us to the spot. Another snap, this time closer. The eyes disappeared, only to reappear on the other side of the camp. Whatever it was toying with us, circling us like prey. Panic set in, and we decided we had to get out of there. Quickly, we doused the fire and grabbed our flashlights, the beams cutting through the darkness. We moved as a group, stumbling through the underbrush, the sounds of pursuit ever present. Twigs snapped, leaves rustled, and that terrifying growl seemed to echo all around us. My heart raced, every shadow morphing into a potential threat. Then, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night. Lisa was gone, yanked into the darkness before we could react. Her screams were quickly drowned out by the sickening sound of tearing flesh and bones snapping. The flashlight beam swung wildly, but there was no sign of her. Just a trail of blood leading deeper into the forest. "Run!" I shouted, adrenaline surging. We sprinted through the trees, not daring to look back. The growls grew more frantic, the creature closing in. We stumbled into a clearing, breathless and terrified. The moonlight revealed our ashen faces, and we realized we were surrounded. Glowing eyes peered out from the trees, dozens of them, all focused on us. This was no ordinary animal. This was the creature of the night, the monster from the legends, brought to life by the full moon. And it was hungry. We had no choice but to keep moving, deeper into the forest, praying for dawn to save us. But as the howls and growls echoed all around, I couldn't shake the feeling that our chances of seeing the sunrise were growing slimmer by the second. The forest was a labyrinth of darkness, the trees towering above us like ancient sentinels. Every rustle of leaves and snap of twigs sent waves of terror through our group. Kevin, Sarah, and I moved as quickly and quietly as we could, our flashlights flickering ominously as if the batteries were about to die. "We have to find a place to hide," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of our hearts. "Maybe there's an old cabin or something," Kevin suggested, his bravado from earlier completely gone. Now, his eyes were wide with fear, constantly scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. We stumbled upon a narrow path that seemed to lead deeper into the forest. With no better options, we followed it, praying it would lead us to safety. The path twisted and turned, and the sounds of pursuit grew fainter, but the oppressive sense of dread only intensified. After what felt like hours, we came across an old, dilapidated cabin. Its wooden walls were weathered and covered in moss, the windows broken, and the door hanging off its hinges. It looked like it hadn't been occupied in years, but it was our only hope. "Let's get inside," I urged, pushing the door open with a creak that echoed through the night. The interior was dark and musty, filled with the remnants of a life long abandoned. Broken furniture, torn curtains, and a thick layer of dust covered everything. We barricaded the door with whatever we could find, our hands trembling with fear and exhaustion. "We should be safe here for a while," Sarah said, though her voice lacked confidence. We huddled together in the center of the room, our flashlights the only source of light. The silence was deafening, broken only by our ragged breathing. But then, the sounds of scratching echoed from the walls, followed by a low, guttural growl. The creature was trying to get in. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the room for another exit. A small, rotting door at the back of the cabin seemed like our only escape. Over there. I pointed, and we scrambled towards it, moving as quickly and quietly as we could. The scratching grew more frantic, the wood creaking under the pressure. We burst through the door into the cold night air, only to find ourselves in a small, enclosed backyard surrounded by tall, spiked fences. There was no way out. Panic set in as the growls grew louder, closer. "Climb the fence!" Kevin shouted, and we didn't need to be told twice. We scrambled up the rough wooden planks, our fingers slipping on the damp wood. Just as I reached the top, a powerful force slammed into the fence, shaking it violently. I looked down and saw it, the creature. It was a grotesque amalgamation of man and beast, its eyes glowing with a malevolent intelligence. Its skin was mottled and stretched taut over a hulking frame, claws digging into the wood as it tried to reach us. Kevin slipped, his flashlight falling to the ground and flickering out. He hung there, helpless, as the creature lunged at him. With a sickening crunch, it dragged him down, his screams cut short by the sound of tearing flesh. "Kevin, no!" Sarah screamed, but there was nothing we could do. We were next if we didn't move. I grabbed her arm and pulled her over the fence, not daring to look back. We ran through the forest, the creature's growls echoing behind us. The darkness closed in around us, and the cold night air bit at our skin. We stumbled upon an old, dried-up riverbed, its banks steep and covered in jagged rocks. It wasn't much, but it offered a temporary reprieve. We slid down the bank and huddled together, our breaths visible in the cold air. "We can't keep running," I whispered. "We need to find a way to fight back." "But how?" Sarah's voice trembled with fear and hopelessness. "I don't know," I admitted, my mind racing. "But we can't just give up. There's got to be something we can use, some way to stop it." The growls grew louder, closer, and I knew our time was running out. We had to find a way to survive the night, or we would become just another story, another warning whispered around the campfire. Days turned into weeks, and the fear that had gripped our town gradually began to fade. Life returned to a semblance of normalcy, but Sarah and I couldn't shake the sense of impending doom. The town was on edge, but the immediate danger seemed to have passed. We tried to move on, to bury the memories of that horrifying night, but the scars ran deep. The sheriff organized regular patrols in the forest, and for a while, there were no more sightings or strange occurrences. Yet, as the next full moon approached, an uneasy tension settled over the town once more. On the night of the full moon, Sarah and I found ourselves at the sheriff's office again, unable to stay away. The memories of Kevin and Lisa's gruesome deaths haunted us, and the fear that more creatures lurked in the shadows kept us on high alert. "Thanks for coming," Sheriff Collins said, his face lined with worry. "We've doubled the patrols tonight. If there's anything out there, we'll find it." We nodded, joining the group of deputies as they prepared to head into the forest. The moon hung low and full in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. The air was thick with anticipation, every sound amplified in the silence of the night. As we moved deeper into the woods, the familiar sense of dread settled over me. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out to snatch us away. We moved cautiously, flashlights cutting through the darkness, eyes scanning for any sign of movement. An hour passed with no sign of the creature, but the tension remained. Then, a blood-curdling scream shattered the silence. We spun around, flashlights swinging wildly. One of the deputies was gone, yanked into the darkness before anyone could react. "Stay together," the sheriff barked, his voice barely concealing his fear. We formed a tight circle, backs to each other, weapons at the ready. The growls started again, echoing through the trees, surrounding us. My heart pounded in my chest, every nerve on edge. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw them, multiple pairs of glowing eyes, watching us from the shadows. "There's more than one," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. The realization hit us like a punch to the gut. The creature we had killed was just one of many. We were outnumbered and outmatched. The growls grew louder, closer, and then the creatures attacked. They came at us from all sides, their monstrous forms a blur of teeth and claws. We fought back desperately, the silver locket the only weapon that seemed to have any effect. But it wasn't enough. One by one, the deputies fell, their screams cut short by the creature's savage attacks. I swung the locket, the silver burning into the flesh of one of the beasts. It howled in pain, but another took its place, lunging at me with a snarl. Sarah was beside me, fighting with everything she had, but we were losing ground. "Retreat!" the sheriff shouted, trying to rally what was left of our group. We stumbled back, trying to escape the onslaught, but the creatures were relentless. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the forest. A shotgun blast. The creature in front of me dropped, its head a bloody mess. I turned to see an older man, his face weathered and determined, holding a smoking shotgun. "Get to the cabin," he shouted, firing again and taking down another creature. We didn't need to be told twice. We ran, following the man through the trees to a small, fortified cabin. He slammed the door shut behind us, bolting it tight. The creatures pounded on the walls, their growls filling the air, but the cabin held strong. "Who are you?" I asked, breathless and terrified. "The name's Hank," he replied, reloading his shotgun. "I've been hunting these things for years. You're lucky I found you when I did." "Thank you," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "But there are so many of them. How do we stop them?" Hank's expression was grim. "You can't kill them all. But you can weaken them. Silver hurts them, but fire is what really does the trick. We need to lure them into a trap, burn them all at once." "How do we do that?" I asked, desperation in my voice. Hank looked at us, a steely determination in his eyes. "We use ourselves as bait." The plan was risky, but we had no other choice. We gathered supplies, setting up makeshift flamethrowers and positioning ourselves around the cabin. The creatures continued their relentless assault, their growls a constant reminder of the danger we faced. As the moon reached its peak, we made our move. Hank led the charge, bursting out of the cabin and drawing the creatures' attention. Sarah and I followed, our makeshift weapons ready. The creatures lunged at us, and we fought back with everything we had, drawing them into the trap. With a final, desperate push, we ignited the fuel, the flames roaring to life and consuming the creatures in a fiery inferno. Their screams filled the air, a horrifying symphony of pain and rage. The fire spread, engulfing the forest, the light of the flames turning the night into day. We watched as the creatures burned, their monstrous forms writhing in the flames. The fire consumed everything, leaving nothing but ash and charred remains. As the sun began to rise, the forest was quiet once more, the threat seemingly vanquished. But as I looked at the fallen beast, a new fear crept in. The legend spoke of one creature, but what if there were more? What if this was just the beginning? The full moon still hung high in the sky, and the night was far from over. The once beautiful Blackwood Forest was now a charred wasteland, the air heavy with the acrid smell of burnt wood and flesh. The fire had done its job, consuming the creatures that had terrorized us, but the cost had been high. Lives had been lost, and the forest, a symbol of our town's natural beauty, was now a haunting reminder of the nightmare we had endured. Sarah, Hank, and I stood at the edge of the destruction, watching the last embers flicker and die out. The town was eerily quiet, the usual morning bustle replaced by a somber silence. The survivors had returned home, trying to piece together their shattered sense of security. "We did it," Sarah whispered, but her voice was hollow. The victory felt empty, overshadowed by the immense loss and the lingering dread that hung in the air. Hank, ever the stoic hunter, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "This isn't over," he said, his voice firm. "There's more to this than just the creatures. We need to understand where they came from and why they attack now." We nodded, knowing he was right. The full moon had awakened something ancient and dark, and until we understood it, we were all still in danger. Hank led us back to his cabin, a fortress of sorts filled with maps, books, and weapons. It was clear he had dedicated his life to hunting these creatures, and now, we were part of his mission. "Let's start with what we know," Hank said, spreading out a map of the area. "The creatures are tied to the full moon, and they're vulnerable to silver and fire. But there's more to the legend." He pulled out an old, tattered book, its pages yellowed with age. "This is the Codex Nocturnus. It's a compilation of ancient texts and local legends about the creatures of the night. According to this, the creatures were once human, transformed by a dark ritual performed under the light of a blood moon." "A blood moon?" Sarah asked, leaning in to read the text. "Is that different from a regular full moon?" Hank nodded. "Yes. A blood moon occurs during a lunar eclipse, when the moon appears red. It's a rare event, and according to the Codex, it's the only time the ritual can be performed. The next blood moon is in 3 months. 3 months? I echoed, feeling a sense of urgency. That's not much time. What do we need to do? Hank's expression was grim. We need to find the source of the ritual and stop it before it happens again. The Codex mentions an old monastery deep in the forest, where the original ritual was performed. If we can find it, we might be able to destroy whatever is allowing these creatures to exist. The plan was clear, but the path ahead was fraught with danger. The monastery was deep within the uncharted part of the forest, a place few had ventured and even fewer had returned from. We spent the next few days preparing, gathering supplies, and studying the maps and texts. Finally, the day came to venture into the heart of the forest. The sheriff, still shaken by the recent events, agreed to let us go, providing us with additional supplies and a radio for communication. The town watched us leave with a mix of hope and fear, knowing that our success or failure would determine their fate. The journey was arduous, the forest thick and unforgiving. The destruction from the fire gradually gave way to dense, untouched wilderness. The deeper we went, the darker it became, as if the trees themselves were closing in on us. After several days of travel, we came across an old, overgrown path. The air grew colder, and an unnatural silence enveloped us. We followed the path, our steps careful and deliberate, until we reached a clearing. In the center stood the ruins of an ancient monastery, its stone walls covered in moss and vines, the air thick with a sense of foreboding. "This is it," Hank said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The source of the ritual." We approached cautiously, the sense of dread growing with each step. Inside, the monastery was dark and cold, the walls lined with strange symbols and artifacts. At the center was an altar, covered in bloodstains and surrounded by bones. "This is where it all began," Hank said, his voice echoing in the silence. "We need to destroy it." We set to work, breaking the altar apart and burning the remains. The fire roared to life, the heat intense and purifying. As the flames consumed the altar, the air grew warmer, and the sense of dread began to lift. But just as we thought we were safe, a low growl echoed through the monastery. We turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows, its eyes glowing with a malevolent intelligence. It was the creature, or what was left of it, twisted and deformed by the fire but still alive. "You cannot stop what has been set in motion," it snarled, its voice a guttural rasp. "The blood moon will rise, and the ritual will be completed." With a final, desperate lunge, the creature attacked. We fought with everything we had, the battle fierce and brutal. Finally, Hank managed to drive his silver knife into its heart, the creature collapsing with a final, blood-curdling scream. The silence that followed was deafening, the air thick with the smell of blood and burnt flesh. We stood there, breathing heavily, the reality of our victory sinking in. The source of the ritual was destroyed, and with it, the threat of the creatures. As we made our way back to town, the weight of what we had accomplished began to lift. The forest was still dark and foreboding, but the sense of imminent danger had faded. We had faced the creatures of the night and survived, but the scars would remain. Back in town, we were greeted as heroes, but the joy was tempered by the memory of those we had lost. The sheriff thanked us, and the townspeople slowly began to rebuild their lives, the fear gradually giving way to hope. But as I lay in bed that night, the full moon casting a pale light through my window, I couldn't shake the feeling that the true terror was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next blood moon. The thought made my skin crawl, and I knew that our battle with the darkness was far from over. The next 2 months passed in a blur of preparation and unease. Though we had destroyed the crystal and eliminated the immediate threat, the fear of what might happen during the upcoming blood moon loomed over us. The town had settled into a cautious optimism, but Sarah, Hank, and I knew better. The darkness that had plagued us was far from defeated. As the night of the blood moon approached, we gathered in Hank's cabin to finalize our plans. The Codex Nocturnus had provided us with invaluable information, but it was clear that we were still missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. "The blood moon is tomorrow night," Hank said, his voice heavy with the weight of what was to come. "If there's any chance of stopping this for good, it's now. We need to be ready for anything." We had armed ourselves with silver weapons, holy water, and fire. We had reinforced the town's defenses and warned the residents to stay indoors. But deep down, we knew that if the creatures returned, it would take more than just weapons to stop them. That night, sleep eluded me once again. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of what might come. The moon hung low in the sky, its light casting eerie shadows across my room. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. The day of the blood moon dawned cold and gray, the sky heavy with the promise of rain. The town was tense, the air thick with anticipation. We gathered in the town square, ready for whatever the night might bring. As the sun set and the moon began to rise, a deep red hue spread across the sky. The blood moon was here, and with it, the terror we had been dreading. We took our positions, weapons at the ready, eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Hours passed, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an owl. Just as we began to hope that maybe, just maybe, we had truly defeated the creatures, a low growl echoed through the night. The sound sent a chill down my spine, and I knew that the battle was about to begin. The creatures emerged from the shadows, their eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. They were larger and more numerous than before, their forms twisted and grotesque. We fought with everything we had, the clash of silver and the roar of flames filling the air. The battle was fierce and brutal. The creatures were relentless, their attacks coordinated and deadly. Despite our best efforts, we were being overwhelmed. One by one, our defenses were breached, and the creatures pushed further into the town. In the midst of the chaos, a terrifying realization struck me. The creatures weren't just attacking at random, they were being controlled, driven by a single, powerful entity. I scanned the battlefield, my eyes landing on a figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching the carnage with a cold, calculating gaze. It was a man, tall and cloaked in darkness. His eyes glowed with the same malevolent light as the creatures, and I knew instantly that he was the one behind the ritual, the true source of the terror that had plagued us. "Sarah, Hank!" I shouted, pointing towards the figure. "That's him. He's controlling them." We fought our way through the chaos, determined to confront the man and put an end to the nightmare once and for all. As we approached, the air grew colder, and a sense of dread settled over us. "You think you can stop me?" The man sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You are nothing but pawns in a game far beyond your understanding." With a flick of his wrist, he summoned more creatures, their forms materializing from the shadows. We fought desperately, but it was clear that we were outmatched. The man's power was immense, and he wielded it with ruthless precision. In a final, desperate attempt, I hurled the silver locket at him. The locket struck his chest, and for a moment, his smug expression faltered. The silver burned into his flesh, and he let out a scream of rage and pain. Seizing the opportunity, Hank lunged forward, driving his silver knife into the man's heart. The man's eyes widened in shock, and he staggered back, the creatures around him howling in agony. "No. This cannot be," he roared, his voice echoing through the night. With a final, ear-splitting scream, the man and his creatures were consumed by a blinding light. The air was filled with the smell of burning flesh, and then, silence. The blood moon began to fade, its eerie glow replaced by the soft light of dawn. The town was in ruins, but the immediate threat was gone. We had defeated the man and his creatures, but at a great cost. As we stood there, battered and exhausted, the first light of morning broke through the clouds. The terror was over, but the scars would remain. We had survived, but the memory of what we had faced would haunt us forever. In the weeks that followed, the town slowly began to rebuild. The fear gradually gave way to hope, and the sense of community strengthened in the face of the shared ordeal. Sarah, Hank, and I became local heroes, but the experience had changed us. One night, as we sat around a campfire, reflecting on everything that had happened, Hank spoke up. "We may have stopped this for now, but there are always shadows lurking in the dark. We need to be vigilant, to protect those we care about." We nodded in agreement, knowing that the battle against the darkness was never truly over. The blood moon had risen and fallen, but the creatures of the night would always be a part of our world. And we would be ready, standing together, to face whatever came next. The creature of the night had been defeated, but the legend would live on, a warning to all who dared to venture into the unknown. And as the moon rose once more, casting its silver light over the forest, we knew that we had faced the darkness and survived, but the true horror was always just one full moon away.